and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How long is that haul? Like, how long is this road really going on for? Really excited to talk to our guests today. Before I introduce them, I want to make sure you know who the voices are on this podcast. I am, of course, your host, Richard Littauer, if that's how you pronounce my name. And I'm joined today by the illustrious and not illustrated Eriol Fox. Eriol, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been a while since I've been on a podcast, I think.
It has been a while, but it's always a pleasure, nay, a privilege. So great to have you here today. And we are joined by longtime guest and previous co-founder of the entire Sustain movement, Chad Whitacre. Chad, how are you doing?
Hello. I'm doing great, and I'm doing better now that I'm with you. Agreed.
So you've been working on open source for a long time. You are the head of open source at Sentry. You formerly did a lot of cool stuff with Radipay and Sustain and been around. But Sentry is, of course, a large commercial offering. They're a company that needs to make money and do cool stuff. At the same time, you've somehow managed to convince the higher ups at Sentry, I don't know how you've done this, it's got to involve illicit activities, that they should fund open source.
Yeah.
Which is cool. So we've had you on before to talk about donating like $500,000 to open source. I think that was 2022.
A tiny bit of history if I can jump in. So Sentry started life in 2008 as an open source side project. Wasn't until 2015 that it became a startup. David and Chris, the two founders, took venture capital and started hiring their friends to work on Sentry with them. So that was 2015. And since then has been growing as a startup. Recently, we announced 100 million ARR and 100,000 cloud subscribers. So off and running. We're now at about 350 employees. I'm coming up on 4 years at Sentry, which is honestly the longest I've ever been at one company, apart from GitTip, Gratipay that you referenced earlier, which doesn't count since it was my own. David and Chris have always been supporters of open source, going back to even before Sentry was a real company. And when I joined 3.5 years ago, David was like, Chad, help us get organized. And so I put together a comprehensive funding program for our open source dependencies. And I do want to give the shout out to David Kramer and to Malin, our CEO, and to even our board. I mean, everybody at the company from the top down is super supportive. You know, open source is really a core part of Sentry's company culture and a core part of Sentry's self-understanding and identity. And the leadership from the top down is very committed to supporting open source, sustaining open source maintainers, which makes my job easy. You know, it's like, Chad, go give money to open source. So 2021 was the first a kind of real program we put together. We gave away $155,000. The next year was $260,000 in 2022. The $500,000 you're talking about was last year, 23, when we gave away $500,000 in 2023. So October is kind of when we land our program. And our budget this year, we're not going to $1 million. I hate to disappoint. We're not doubling again. We're going to do $750,000 this year as our budget. But really the bigger picture this year is, okay, Sentry, we've done this program for 3 years now, and it's been great. There's not nearly enough zeros at the end of that number. It's great that Sentry is able to do what it's able to do, but at the end of the day, Sentry is just one of many, many companies throughout basically our whole civilization that depend on open source software. And so the ask this year from leadership at Sentry was from David, Chad, go get other companies to do the same thing. Go get other companies to also step up and contribute to paying the maintainers along the same lines that we've been doing. So that is sort of what I'm bringing to the table to talk about. We call it Open Source Pledge. So that's launching on October 8th. And we're doing a big media launch on October 8th, but we're kind of already out the door and onboarding folks to that, to build up to that. So we have that to share and talk about. That's news. And then the other thing is fair source. We can decide if we want to go there. That's maybe tangential, but
I have an immediate question. So thank you for all that context. That's amazing and cool. I must have mentioned this before, but I'm just going to ask it again because I'm as forgetful as our listeners. You say, oh, it's cool. People love open source. Chad, go spend money on open source. That is not a clear connection. It is not clear to anyone at the table that donating to open source builds a more resilient ecosystem. How have you convinced people that is the case?
So there's a few levers. And the one that we're working with in the open source pledge is honestly FOMO, social validation / social pressure. Humans are social creatures and companies are collections of humans. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of herd instinct in industry. There's a lot of companies kind of following the lead of other companies and not wanting to be seen. I mean, come on. 2 years ago, was anybody talking about AI? And now here we are, right? And it's like every company, look at how quickly every company pivoted to become an AI company. That's sort of the way to think about this point of leverage, really, which is that there is a social aspect, this point of leverage. So that's really what we're working with the open source pledge. Another angle on this, from Sentry's point of view, the investment in open source, I'll just go ahead and say it. This is brand marketing for us. Sentry's reached that point where we're a large enough company. The way that marketing happens at larger companies, it's brand marketing. It's what does extreme sports have to do with energy drinks? Nothing and everything, but Red Bull is like out there sponsoring all the X Games and whatever. It's this kind of thing. Is Coca-Cola even selling Coca-Cola anymore? You know, like they're selling Red and they're selling a feeling, you know, it's like FIFA and whatever, right? So for Sentry, our primary brand values are around open source and particularly developer sustainability in open source. And then a couple other things too. So we've got a big kind of security privacy focus. And then the third one for us is honestly just cool swag. Like we just sponsored a basketball game at Laracon. Like we just get to do these shenanigans. So we have like, yeah, fun stuff like that. So open source is, again, a core part of Sentry's company culture and really a core part of Sentry's brand identity at the end of the day. And so there's sort of like cynical takes on it, but then also just sort of realistic takes on it. This is how these things happen. So yeah, so that's the rationale for our leadership, for our investors, for our board on why investing in open source makes sense for Sentry. It's because Sentry is selling a product to developers and developers love open source and we love open source and it's part of building that brand.
My immediate follow-on question, take something like OSS Pledge. The idea is to get companies to pledge $2,000 per developer in-house towards open source. Hey, let's all work together to fund the ecosystem. Yeah. Won't that dilute your brand? Because you're asking everyone else to make this their brand as well?
No, because there's a minimum to get in the door. We developed this metric called dollars per developer as a way to kind of reason about payments to open source maintainers across companies of different sizes. So Sentry, you know, I think we count 140 developers or something like this. And another company, so it was actually just today, just an hour or two ago, that we pushed the button and onboarded our first 2 members, company members for the open source pledge. So we'll see when this airs and how many members we've got onboarded by then. But Sentry and then Astral, Astral.sh, which is a kind of Python tooling written in Rust and building a company around that, Charlie Marsh and co. Sentry and Astral are the 2 that have joined. Sentry's got 140 developers. I think, you know, we can look it up. Astral's much earlier in their growth. So they're, call it 5 or 10, right? So we look at dollars per developer. So last year, Sentry spent $500,000. We had 132 developers, whatever, worked out to, I think, $3,700 per developer. And then Astral is paying like $3,250 per dev. So we're working with this dollars per developer, meaning how many developers do you have on staff? Because they're the ones that benefit from open source the most. They're the ones whom open source makes more productive. They're the ones that would have to go write stuff themselves or buy a comparable product or whatever in order to do their work. Yeah, so we look at dollars per dev as the metric. What I'm trying to say is the number to get in the door is $2,000 per dev. So we're trying to say, look, anything that any company gives to open source is great. To be part of this club, you need to pay $2,000 per developer on staff per year. And then you get to say, it's like 1% for the planet kind of thing, right? It's like we're going for receipts. We're going for, so A, go pay $2,000, at least $2,000 per dev per year to open source maintainers and foundations. Then publish a blog post once a year that tells us what you did and gives us receipts. And then we're going to pull those in and put that on osspledge.com. Right. So that's the way that we end up not diluting our brand, because it's like, well, the other companies that are with us in this are also doing significant amounts to open source projects. Yeah. So I kind of say like, that's your membership dues at the club, which gets you the privilege of paying more at the club for dinner. You know what I mean? It's a fine balance. We've actually talked a lot about pricing that. Like, that's a big conversation to have and say the numbers get pretty big when you talk to larger companies and it becomes a big ask. And then it's Sentry being seen as, for us to be leading this is, that's what we're here for, right? Let's put up or shut up. Let's get this done. Let's quit beating around the bush and solve this problem for once. Going back to what you're saying earlier, is there an actual destination we're getting towards on this road?
No, I love it. I love it. The passion comes through in how much this needs to be talked about. And it really does. I think, though, for me, there is always like a little gentle to my heart when I hear dollars per dev or developers love open source. I'm not a developer. I love open source and I maintain open source. I'm an open source designer. So it's like, oh, ow. So I suppose my question is, you talked a little bit about how AI has now become prevalent and that sometimes open source is not, in a way, immune to fashion or trends in a way. And so coming from a space of open source, which is desperately underfunded, like design, desperately undersupported, how can maintainers that aren't kind of like the typical maintainers and open source projects that aren't the typical open source projects make themselves more clearly able to be like on the receiving end of, say, the pledge funds? Or like, do you find that the pledge funds typically go to the kind of open source that always gets funded?
So 2 things here. I do want to directly address your question, which is about allocating funds and making sure that the money that we're paying into open source is actually having a good impact. But before that, Eriol, let me apologize. First of all, I didn't mean to kind of exclude all the roles that go into open source. Who consumes your work as an open source designer?
Users of open source. Yeah.
Do you have a main project you work on? I'm sorry for not.
I mainly maintain Open Source Design, which is a repository for open source projects to find designers to make contributions.
Got it.
So it's more of a social like connection platform. But then I've also, worked on data collection platforms. I've worked on CVCRM. I've worked on lots of different, mostly nonprofit related open source and human rights related open source.
Gotcha. So I think some of what's going on here is that open source is not monolithic. There's a lot that we can talk about in terms of the components of the open source community and different kinds of open source and ways to segment and think about it and break it down. When I talk about that dollars per dev metric, the main problem that we're looking at is this sustainability crisis, like the XKCD dependency cartoon that so many of us are familiar with, where billion-dollar businesses are being built on open source components that are maintained on the side in somebody's spare time. So when we talk about dollars per dev, that's developers employed by companies. That's the developer we're referring to there. Okay. So it's just trying to come up with a way to reason about what is fair for companies to pay to open source, kind of on a first principles analysis, like how should we think about what's fair for companies to pay? And the best we've come up with is, well, yes, there's open source programs like Inkscape and LibreOffice and things. We're not focused so much on that. We're more thinking about what are the libraries in a company's dependency tree, dependency graph that they couldn't build their product without. That's the main focus for us, is how do we make sure that stuff gets funded, first of all. I would love for there to be a future in which Inkscape is a serious competitor to Adobe Illustrator or whatever, and like we'll get there step by step. So good call out that there's different components to open source. What we're focused on is really kind of this libraries, frameworks, language ecosystems that companies depend on for their stack to build their own product. And the ones that are really helped by that are the developers on staff at the company. So that's where our dollars per dev number comes in. I want to come back to your question though, which was around allocation. What I would offer is that there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in Europe with the CRA. And I know you all have talked about this on the podcast here. The CRA is changing open source forever by elevating the role of open source foundations to be these open source software stewards. This role of the open source steward is now written into European law. So prior to this, you had manufacturers and you had individuals. And those are like the two kinds of things that European law, around product safety and whatever was concerned with. Are the manufacturers building products that are safe for consumers? Now there's a third, through a lot of hard work by a lot of people in the community in Brussels, I guess we now have this third category, which is open source software steward, which is essentially recognizing the role of foundations to steward their projects, whether that be a language ecosystem or any kind of open source project like Civi CRM. I don't know the governance of it, but any kind of end user software that's open source. So Blender, for example, has a foundation. So the role of the foundation is becoming much more important. And kind of the lines between here's an individual maintainer working on this project in their spare time, and here's a foundation that is stewarding an ecosystem of projects, which includes some of these libraries that companies are depending on. Those lines are in the process of becoming much clearer. And this is a long way around to say that I think there's a big opportunity for us to help our foundations to rise to meet the challenge and to become the sorts of institutions that have a much greater role to play in allocating those funds. I'm sitting here at Sentry. I don't actually care about 5,000 dependencies that we use from the point of view, and I care a lot, right? And like the long tail of companies that don't have the kind of open source innovator mindset that we still want to participate in the pledge. It's like, okay, tell us what stacks do you use? You use Rust and you use Python, okay? Give your money kind of in larger chunks to a foundation that is the steward of that ecosystem. And then let's help our foundations rise to the challenge of saying, okay, now within our ecosystem, how do we spend this money as a community, right? As a community now, how are we going to allocate those funds? Because it's all the roles. So foundations have this opportunity to become weird software companies in a way. Like when you look at the history of this, and I have a whole post on this, maybe we can share it in the link for this episode. You go back to 2009 and Stephen Wally, and I forget who his co-author was, but they wrote a paper on open source foundations in 2009, where they looked at what are the things foundations do. And that scope has expanded year over year in the past 15 years. To the point where like foundations, PHP is one of my favorite because they're a newer foundation. They're like, we pay developers to work on PHP. And it's, who'd have thunk it, but look at the Linux Foundation, $300 million budget and 3% of it goes to Linux kernel development. Our foundations are not necessarily in paying maintainers, to be frank, let alone designers, okay? Let alone all the roles that go into delivering a product. And a company like Sentry, that's a commercial software company, has all these roles. We have designers, we have product designers, we have creative team, we have a whole sales team, we have marketing, we have all the things you expect from a company. And I think what we're seeing over time is that foundations are kind of growing their own community version of all of these different functions. And so I see them as having a really critical role in kind of addressing this question that you're raising, Eriol.
I do want to point out that foundations don't fund developers because they're explicitly denied from doing that under 501c3 law in the US.
People do it. No, how is PHP doing it?
Yeah, you can only do a small amount. You can't do a lot.
That's most of their budget. I hear this and I don't think it's settled. And look, I'm not the expert. I'm not in foundations, but I see PHP paying developers where there's a come on.
I'm the executive director of a foundation at the moment. So
okay, which one?
GNOME.
Okay. Let me put it this way.
Go ahead.
When I did GitTip and I was tiny and it was a financial services company. I was trying to do everything by the books in public. So learning all the financial services law in public. And then I watched Patreon come along. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Law doesn't come from nowhere. Law is an agreement between humans. And now we have this new economic entity. It's like, maybe we need to have a conversation about foundations should be able to pay developers. I just see so much opportunity here for us. To me, this is a big cultural moment where we're changing the relationship of individuals and institutions. And the opportunity almost couldn't be bigger. It's like we're this opportunity to take this beautiful thing, free and open source software that brings people together in community, in intrinsic motivation. That's the beauty of open source when it works well, is we're all there because we want to be there. And we're not there because we have to do it for a paycheck. We're there because we want to be there and we're working together on this thing. And it's beautiful and it's great. We have to figure out, we have the opportunity to figure out how to plug that into an economy to say, I am here as a member of a community that is operating out of free will, engaging in this. And it's the gig economy is like the dark version of this, where it's, hey, I'm free to go drive for whatever, be a task rabbit or whatever, right? And it's okay, but that's not really what we were going for. It's like Airbnb started it, right? Or whatever. That it's like, the beginning of Airbnb, it was like, you're sleeping on people's couches. The origin story is I crashed on my friend's couch and it was this beautiful community thing. And now it's just like crappier hotels to a certain extent. So the gig economy is kind of the dark version of this. But this is the hope. This is the vision that I have anyways, that we can somehow find a way to keep what's great about open source, which is the intrinsic motivation, the working together, the collaborative. And it's not competitive too. It's like you're balancing competition between GNOME and KDE and whatever, right? To kind of bring that example in. But then you're plugging in the economic aspect. You're bringing an economic layering into it so that somebody can freely participate in open source and get money for it, and get paid enough to live on. And that's a really beautiful thing if we can pull it off. Sorry.
It really makes sense because to me, it's a good soapbox. It needs to be taken to as many places, this soapbox, as possible and talked about. Because I think for me, when I started to read about the open source pledge and kind of what it was saying is I agree, any amount of money that goes towards open source, great, more money, fantastic. But I feel like the open source pledge, what it does is it gives more vocabulary and more of a talking point for the inclusion of organizations, companies, and their employees to participate in that conversation. As you were saying at the beginning, it's the brand building, it's the conversation that can be started from the company with the developers, with the team members that would be the 2000 contribution, in order to really feel like that intrinsic part of open source again. And I think sometimes like the money is abstracted out to the level of like organizations and foundations, and it doesn't include the people. So that's why I think that the pledge is special. And so I love hearing about like how it humanizes the funding aspect of things. But yeah, that's my tiny little soapbox next to yours. Like,
so we'll see. We have a major media campaign launching on October 8th, meaning we've paid for 3 billboards in San Francisco on the Bay Bridge. So people stuck in rush hour traffic in San Francisco are going to look up and see somewhat spicy billboards that poke and prod at the idea of companies not paying for open source and suggesting that open source pledge is something that companies should be part of. I like what you say about a vocabulary, Eriol, because that's absolutely what we're trying to do. We're trying to establish a new social norm. We're trying to say, this is what you do. I got to bring this in. I love this analogy of a restaurant. Okay. Open source is a restaurant. It's not a grocery store. It's not a soup kitchen. It's a restaurant. So in a grocery store, this is what I mean by this. In a grocery store, you pay first and then you get to eat the food. And in a soup kitchen, somebody else pays and you get to eat. It's a charity. But in a restaurant, you eat first and then you pay. You consume the food at the table. And then at the end, you're presented with the bill and you settle up. So this is how I see open source, is that our companies are feasting at the open source table year after year. We're consuming open source year after year. So when we're with the pledge, when we're paying for open source, we're not paying for next year's open source. We're paying for last year's open source that we've already consumed. Again, what I love about the restaurant analogy is the social aspect of it. It's if you got 4, 6, 8 people sitting around a table at the end, it's like, all right, how are we going to split this check? And if somebody doesn't have their wallet, or it's like that one friend who's always a little flaky, it's like, oh, okay, well, we're paying for them, right? Or whatever. And we can help each other out too, of course. But the point is that there's this social aspect to it. And that's very much what we're trying to do with the pledge, is get together all the companies that certainly can pay and say, okay, here's how we're going to split this check. That's really the vibe we're going for.
I am curious about that. I like the metaphor of a restaurant. You mentioned that you're paying for last year's open source, not future open source. My question is, how does that work on the ground? Because I've seen very few funds go to open source maintainers or companies where they're like, you can just have this and we're not asking you to continue to maintain the product or continue to develop features. How are you making that very clear to maintainers that they just can put that in a bucket and just file it away in their taxes and pay their rent?
So practically speaking, the open source pledge, osspledge.com, there's no flow of funds involved in OSS Pledge. So we don't have a legal entity that's taking money and handing it out. We are very thin, and we're just putting that $2,000 per dev per year number out there on the one hand, and on the other hand, identifying a reporting scheme. So saying, to be a member of the pledge, you pay this money, you report it. How you actually spend that money and who you actually give it to, we want you to give us that information, but we're not telling you how to do that. So what we're trying to do is incentivize all of the, in the same way that we were talking about foundations earlier, it's like foundations are a very critical component of this whole ecosystem. Another critical component is platforms, Open Collective, GitHub sponsors, Thanks.dev, LiberaPay, TideLift. There's these platforms out there that do exist to help companies pay for their open source dependencies. And the goal is that these platforms will rise to the challenge as well. We'll evolve. We're all going to evolve this together. We've got the glimmers of it, but like GitHub sponsors is, well, I'll put it this way. To get Sentry onboarded, we wanted to give a report on the money Sentry spent through GitHub sponsors for the past year to which particular maintainers. Okay, we wanted this report. That was very hard to get. We couldn't actually get it. We ended up writing a script that pulls from their GraphQL and like reverse engineers how much money was given to each individual maintainer. I don't actually have the details on it, but it was like, point is like, these platforms are not where they need to be product-wise to support what we're trying to do with the pledge. And in the same way that foundations have this opportunity to kind of rise to the challenge of making sure this money gets allocated in a great way, platforms have a big opportunity to help us get the visibility that we're looking for. And so pledge is really about like the thinnest, tiniest, it's a little drop in the solution that catalyzes or something, right? And brings together all these components that kind of exist right now, but need that oomph. I mean, look, we need money. We need enough zeros behind the dollar amounts flowing through this to really make this robust and incentivize people to work on making this what it needs to be.
I don't think I got an answer to my question. So you are sending money into the ecosystem, great, using platforms like Open Collective, which is also a foundation. So it's really foundations and fiscal hosts which go to these things. Okay. GitHub sponsors is different because it's owned by a very large for-profit company, but it doesn't matter. There are ways of getting money to developers, and we want to make sure that we make it easier to see how the money is flowing. My question is that as part of the social change you're suggesting, let's pay maintainers for work that they've already done. How are you on the ground making sure that that isn't always brought along with strings attached for those maintainers to continue developing their very small box in the Kansas problem from XPC?
Yeah, the platforms enforce that. ThanksDiv is the main platform that I'm using right now. I'm using a little bit of GitHub sponsors, and I'm actually interested in some stuff I just heard Open Collective is working on. But I give money through ThanksDiv. It's like I'm giving to hundreds of projects. It's part of the social contract of the platform that I know on GitHub, you can have sponsor levels and whatever that maybe have some rewards associated with it. But honestly, I've never even really used any of that as a sponsor. So I don't even know, is that strictly enforced on GitHub? They might have started to add some of this where it's, well, you get more Patreon style, right? Where it's because you paid, you've unlocked this thing. I think that is kind of soft there in GitHub sponsors.
It is soft there, but I'm more curious about, so like Sentry's got it, right? This is your brand. This is your marketing. We give money to open source maintainers because we value open source.
Yeah.
That's dope. And I'm in no way knocking that. What I'm trying to figure out is the other companies that are giving money. are incentivized to do so because their boards or their staff or their leadership is, we got to make sure that the ecosystem is better and that we continue to have support and that people continue to work for us for free.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to make sure that that's not the case in everyone who pledges.
Well, I don't care if that's the case as long as they pay. I don't care what the motivations are as long as they're paying $2,000 per dev per year into the ecosystem. Because again, I think the social expectation on the platforms is, I don't know what it would look like for a company to use a platform like ThanksDev or GitHub sponsors even. I can imagine, and there's occasionally like some dev at Microsoft or a big company comes into an open source project with this entitled attitude that's, hey, fix my bugs, right? We see that pop up from time to time, and it's like, hey, this is volunteers. If you want your bug fixed, then fix it yourself. And you're probably not even paying me anyway. So maybe we see a little more of that if there's payment happening. But yeah, I just see that as social norm. I don't think that we have that now with the companies that are paying through. Because look, there's much easier ways to pay and get something for it. It's like we have support contracts, we have contracts. And honestly, the whole grant model that we have in the philanthropic side of philanthropy in general, but philanthropy of open source. I love what Sovereign Tech Fund is doing. They're unlocking a lot of funds for open source. And actually, I saw something more recently where they're primarily grant-based, and grants come with strings attached. Like there's nothing more strings attached in a grant. It's, you give us a scope of work, and 9 months from now, it's, I'm going to do this thing in 9 months' time, and this is the money I need for it. And then you get the money and you go do the thing. And then 9 months later, the nonprofit follows up and says, did you do the thing? That's much more strings attached than anything Sentry or other companies giving on Open Collective and GitHub sponsors are doing. So I think the culture is already there on the corporate side for the money that you're giving through these platforms is no strings attached. And it's really, ironically, like on the nonprofit, on the philanthropic side, where we have that kind of cultural challenge of overcoming that strings attached nature in the grants.
Cool.
Do you buy it, Richard?
I don't. That's okay. My opinion doesn't matter very much. I'm just one person in a larger scheme. I'm excited to have money go towards open source. I still don't have answered, hey, how does money actually help open source projects in the long run, and how to build a more reliable ecosystem, which is sad because this is episode number 2,573. But, it's not. It's 3,300. But it's tough.
I want to create this problem for people. I know we're kind of coming up on time. I want to create this problem. I want to add 1 or 2 zeros to the overall money going into the open source ecosystem, so that this is a problem that the foundations and the platforms and the maintainers, that we all have to solve together. Plug for, and I don't know again when this episode is coming out, but it's probably not soon enough. September 5th, we are having an ecosystem kickoff call. So by the time this airs, this will have happened. But we are being proactive about, because even though the pledge is companies, we need to have that relationship with the ecosystem, with maintainers, with foundations, with platforms. So we're being proactive about that. So we're hosting a first ecosystem call next Thursday on the 5th, and we'll see where it goes from there. I expect there'll be some regular communication.
Yeah, amazing. I will drop that in the links as well. And we'll also drop the open source pledge URL. Feel free to go to osspledge.com and check out OSS Pledge. It's going to be launched on October 8th, but there it is.
The billboards go up on October 8th. So we need everybody to help us be ready to really promote it when the billboards go up. We're going big.
Let's go.
I'm excited to see the design of those billboards.
Yeah.
Maybe we could open source those designs.
We've shared some stuff in the GitHub. I'll link you in.
Amazing. I'd love to see that, actually.
Chad, it's really unfortunate that there's only one of you and that we only have one podcast, because ideally we could talk more about all the sorts of things you have. I was actually trying to find another thing that I signed up for, some other initiative of yours. I couldn't even find it because there's just too many URLs with Chad.
We mentioned FairSource, so we didn't get back to that, but
just answer my question briefly. Is FairSource just a uniquely new wrapping on delayed open source development, where you push it out after you've worked on it a bit internally, so that you can make sure that maintainers can actually have time to get this stuff, but also companies have time to make money off it first?
More or less, yeah. There's a whole nother soapbox there, but yeah, we'll have to do this again.
And you can check that out at fair.io. But we are running up on time. That is the end of what we have for this podcast. Chad, osspledge.com, fair.io, thanks.dev, and the other one that's important is openpath.chad Whitacre, WHITACRE.com. Anything else I should link?
No,
Excellent.
Nothing else.
Well, then don't leave now, because at the end of every show, we have a sort of irrelevant bit where we just give back, because that's what we're all about here, giving back to our community. So this is Spotlight, which I pronounce in a Boston accent since Caitlin Taney. Thank you, Caitlin, for giving me the go-ahead for that. Spotlight's where we highlight people, projects, books, mentors that have helped us out in the past, and we just want to give them some love. Eriol, what's your spotlight today?
My spotlight today is deeply indulgent, given that I've recently come back from COSCUP, which is Taiwan's amazing open source conference. Folks, if people haven't been to COSCUP, I would really recommend it. We did a design open source contribution hackathon for a day there at COSCUP, which was amazing. We had a room full of designers doing contributions to open source. And one of the projects is an amazing project called Cofacts. Cofacts is a fact-checking, open source fact-checking platform for Taiwanese citizens to fact-check. They built an API for rumors that works with a line bot, and it's a really worthwhile project for everyone to check out and contribute to.
Amazing. Thank you so much. My spotlight today is a more personal one. Just give a shout out to Rob Kyff, who was my advisor when I was in high school. Rob Kyff was there, and honestly, I don't know how he didn't shake me physically every day and be like, you should just do the work that you're assigned. He was really, really compassionate and a really great teacher. And looking back, I can see the amount of care that he put into his work. And I'm just so grateful. Good teachers who don't necessarily teach you something, but are there to be supportive are a treasure. So Rob Kyff, thanks for being my advisor in my 11th and 12th grades of high school. Chad, what's your spotlight?
My spotlight, I would like to give a shout out to Kim Coggin. So Kim is a dry stack stonewaller, and she runs a workshop teaching facility about 2 hours from here on the other side of Pittsburgh called Laurel Stoneworks. It's an extension site of the Stone Trust, which is based in Vermont. Our property has lots of stone walls that are falling over, and Kim is the only reason that I have any hope of ever actually repairing these stone walls. So big shout out to Kim for all of the encouragement and teaching on the skill of dry stack stone walling.
Oh man, I want a whole nother podcast. Dry stack stone walling or dry stone diking is like a pet passion of mine. So let's talk about that later some other time.
I love it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this podcast. It's been really great to have you on. You are the unsung, unspoken masses who make this thing go around. And you do that primarily in a few different ways, which I'm going to just straight up prescriptively tell you. First off, you tell your friends about this podcast. You say, this is the cool podcast to listen to, and they should all go up and sign up for the OSS Pledge. 2, you give us feedback. You go to podcast@sustainoss.org and send us notes on this podcast. You can also just go to Chad's website and send him notes on the podcast. Tell him other podcasts he should be on, better podcasts. You can also donate directly to this open source project. I literally shared how to do a podcast, an open source markdown file with Chad at the beginning of this podcast beforehand. This is an open source podcast too, which means you can donate money to it from your company's open source budget. Go to opencollective.com/sustainoss. This work is not done for free. So yeah, please do that. Also like this wherever it is. If it's like Apple, Spotify, whatever, just say that you like it. And finally, thank everyone who comes on this podcast and shares it. And thanks, Chad, for coming on today. It's been great to have you. Good luck with everything. Looking forward to the billboards, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Eriol.